our first class, if you don't really count going through the syllabus as our first class. And so what we're going to spend our time today talking about is international development. And I put an agenda in the chat box for you guys to see what we're going to go through. And the readings that I gave you, that's not even really a taste of the discussion of this field of international development. But on the one hand, there's Sachs, and then on the other hand, there's Easterly, all the way at the other end of the spectrum. And so, some of you guys are really interested in this topic, and others, I think you're just really exploring it as context for the internships that you're doing in schools or NGOs. But when you think about the spectrum of international development, these are the two polar opposites in terms of philosophies on it. And I wanted you to read Sachs first. A lot of the times people gravitate more towards Easterly because there's that colorful component of heroes at the grassroots who are really making a difference versus the Sachs aspect of development coming from the top down, from far away. But in reading your different response papers, it seemed as if you guys were pretty well split on where things should come from and the whole aspect of the philosophy behind this kind of work in this field. So what I wanted to start off by doing was coming up with a definition for international development. And I wanted to give you guys a first whack at trying to define what it is that you think international development is. And we'll go from there to poverty and defining that, and then we'll talk about the positives and the negatives of each one of these arguments, the planners versus the searchers. Yeah, Isaiah.
So I'd like to take a whack at the international developing thing. So I think the international development it's kind of just getting all of the nations.
Speak a little bit closer to the microphone, please.
International development is kind of just trying to get all of the nations of the world on the same page, or like on the same economic level. You got me?
Yep.
Wait, can I think that's a good idea.
What? Alright, you want to just come over there? I just wanted to get used to it with my computer.
It just like makes it really hard. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it would work out better because there's a little bit of an echo if you guys are so close to each other in that way. And I think that you guys muted your microphone too.
The noise, I thought that would maybe affect that.
Okay. So Isaiah said international development is getting everyone in the world to basically the same level of basic of living, if I can paraphrase there a little bit. What about more input into the idea of what is international development? Taylor, please.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think that for international development, I think that really means how well and how local and national partners are working together to ensure that there's sustained development for everybody. So.
Yeah. Can we take a step back and say why is it that we need to get people on the same page if we all agree that, I mean, that when we say the same page, I think what we're saying is that there's universal human rights and basic rights that everybody has. Why is it that we are in a state of inequity at the moment?
I think it's really because there are some nations who just benefit more out of certain developments than others. I feel like, for example, America, I think we're improving economically, we're improving politically and socially, and in some ways, we kind of benefit other countries rather than helping them. I feel like there's not really a obvious effort in making sure that we help every vulnerable population in the nation. You're right, so.
Okay, I only caught part of that. Can you try again? I'm sorry.
I think that it would help if you mute your mic while she's talking. I think there's like a feedback going on.
Okay.
So I think really what it is that it's just like the development is just very one-sided. I feel like, for example, with America, I feel like we're improving like politically, economically, socially, and I feel like a lot of these developments, like we're improving, but we're not really doing a lot to help uplift other vulnerable populations and other nations. And I just feel like, in that sense, I just feel like you're saying like that's one-sided. Yeah, no, yeah, I just feel like it's very, like there's just not very like there's not really two people working together for the one goal. I really just feel like it's us who want to, like, I can't really put it into words right now. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Somebody else want to pick up Layla's train of thought there?
What'd you say?
I said, would someone like to pick up on the direction that Layla was headed in? She was talking about the United States' role and beginning to get into other international powers with this.
What I was gonna say is like towards, is it important? I feel like at some point it might, global developing, like focusing on that might be counterproductive. I know up to a point it's like we're all just trying to fuel the economy and everybody could like progress and like everybody's mind contributing would be like beneficial to everybody or whatever the case may be. But when I was doing those readings and kind of what I expressed in my paper was that I feel like we might reach a point where it might be more counterproductive.
I think like that's kind of the question of like human morale and like on an individual level, what you think in your heart is right. So like I don't know. I mean, I think we need to.
Guys, let's take a wider view of this and think about. Kate, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I think the international development is really, like in a broader sense, supposed to be a global effort between developed countries and lesser developed countries to basically raise the standard of living in general and make sure, or to ensure that everyone has basic human rights at a very fundamental level. And I think what Layla was kind of saying is that this gets skewed because other interests come into play, where it becomes easier to look at what is best for your own country, and maybe sometimes that's not what's best for the lesser developed countries. So we put them in lots of kind of deals that end up trapping them into this state where it's just so much inequality. And even if what we're trying to attain isn't complete inequality, or isn't complete equality on like at an economic level with every country, it's really hard to even have them, like some of these countries, like a lot of African countries, don't even have basic human rights that are being met. So lots of people are still suffering from so many diseases and problems that I think could be fixed if other countries like that are more developed, for example, the United States, put more effort into focusing on the problems of those countries instead of looking more into their own self-interest.
That was great. That was a great pulling together a few different ideas there. And before we get to how we should do it, let's just spend another minute on what it actually is. And so I put this definition that I came up with in the chat box in terms of what is international development. And I think it's almost impossible to talk about this topic without understanding where it is that these challenges or problems are coming from, that you have centuries of colonization where you have more developed, and I'm using developed in air quotes because it's a very relative term in terms of European countries that were developed in a certain way, whereas you have southern hemisphere countries that were developed in other ways that basically looked at Africa, the Middle East, Asia, South America, parts of South America, North America as places of resources that existed to be the resources for the sustainment of their lives and the perpetuation of their wealth. And it created an incredible disparity of colonial powers taking from these different places, but then not building systems that were commensurate to the systems that they have. When I say systems, you can talk about a judicial system, electoral system, talking about education system, that it runs across the whole span of the pillars of how our societies are constructed today. Now, the same kind of thing, I like to think that the same kind of thing could not happen today because post-World War II, we've moved on from an environment where we felt as if that was okay, that based upon the people's height or the color of their skin or their gender or whatever the characteristic of discrimination might be, that these other people don't exist in order to provide for our wealth and to help improve our systems. Now the problem is, in terms of having all these new independent states that came into being post-World War I, post-World War II, is, and even, we don't have anyone from Tajikistan in this class or that is serving in Tajikistan, but there's a very real comparison to post-Soviet as well in terms of the break of the Soviet Union in the late 80s in the new Central Asian states, is that you have these remnants of systems from their colonial powers that are not quite equipped in the same way to provide for their citizens to have a whole range of opportunities. And I put that down below in that definition, is that you see that international development spans such a wide range of different areas, from food and water security to healthcare to human rights is one that we think about pretty frequently, but even infrastructure that, as you guys travel around Jakarta and notice how narrow the roads are, and how is it that as you sit in traffic all the time, that's part of development as well in terms of moving towards communal transportation systems and having that capacity. And the same thing goes for Zanzibar. A number of you are teaching in the schools and looking at their education system and how to continue to improve to a level where citizens are afforded the opportunities or can carve out the opportunities that that we considered universal. And that's the underpinning of this, is that we are operating from a perspective where everyone is equal regardless of their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their nationality, and that if you plucked each one of us down, or any of the students that you're working with or young people you're working with in your placements, and you put them in the best schools in the United States or in our electoral system, whatever the case may be, is that we all have the capacity to achieve the same thing. That it's not as if that there's some sort of superiority that we have as Europeans or Westerners or Americans that enables us to have a certain potential that Indonesians or Zanzibaris or others may not have. Any thoughts on that?
I always just think about, like, whether or not these countries were colonized, if we left them in their traditional states, like, would they have developed the way that maybe, like, Western nations have? Because I think that's something that, like, I'm not saying that, obviously, colonization had, like, a detrimental effect on these nations, but in what way would those countries, how would those countries have been able to develop without any kind of outside influence? Just being that they were so closed off from the rest of the world. I mean, I guess that's more of a question than it is a statement. But
I think it's a provocative discussion question. I think that you can point to sources of enlightenment and achievement as coming from all over the world, not just from Western Europe, though. And that if you look at the Middle East in terms of this is the cradle of monotheistic religions, and that those ideas came out of the Middle East and went to Europe, not vice versa. You look at math and algebra was also created in the Middle East, and you can go sort of piece by piece in terms of cultural influences that have come out of different places. Ideas for self-government, and it's a hypothetical that I can't answer, like, what would have been created in Indonesia had the Dutch not colonized Indonesia. Japan is an example of a closed society until the mid-1800s, where there was very little outside influence, and one can study the culture and the history there and look at the incredible achievements that they had. So there's certainly ways to argue this one way or the other. I do feel as if our experience in the United States over the last 200 plus years has a lot to offer to other countries in terms of positive things, but we did spend the first almost 100 years of our country enslaving Africans, and I'm not sure that that is so it's not all good, not all bad, but I tend to think that there's a lot of good things that good ideas come from many different places, and that Western philosophies don't have ownership over that.
Kind of piggybacking on what Paula said and what you're getting at. I kind of feel like, and this is what I kind of touched upon in my paper as well, I feel like before World War II, all those colonies kind of had like a detrimental effect, like maybe with the exception of a few to the developing countries. But I feel like now it would be nice, or I would even say like possible to be able to colonize in a country and do it like the right way and set up like schools and social and economic systems and try to get like that country to contribute in the global economy and stuff like that. Kind of just give them the push start that they need without having racism and all those like stuff that we kind of have systems now to prevent. So I don't know. I kind of feel like colonizing in theory could be done right, and it could have good effects. And
Yeah, I think that the purpose of colonization isn't really, it's kind of to take from the country that you were colonizing. So like, that's kind of where we come into the issue of, like, we don't want to put so much effort into these countries because, I guess you can ask the question, what are we really getting in return rather, besides just a more equal, it's just like.
I feel like when we want countries to develop, it's kind of to ultimately contribute in the global economy and like this and that and like other stuff, but it's ultimately just to kind of take from them anyway. It would be nice to like give them, set up a system and stuff like that.
Yeah, it just cost benefit kind of. Obviously, like we're all looking for help. I'm not like, I don't want to sound like I'm like anti. Assisting creation.
You guys are framing the discussion actually that we're going to have about the Easterly and Sachs argument. Isaiah is putting forward Isaiah's position, Sachs's position of top-down development, and Paula is beginning to speak to the Easterly argument of things are not. We're not in a lab here, and we can't do things in a way that are perfect as an exact science. And this is, I think, what both Layla and Kate were speaking to earlier, is that it's impossible that our own self-interests as a nation are not going to somehow work their way into the agenda. That, if you look at our institutions in terms of the United Nations, IMF, these international institutions were set up post-World War II. They just can't seem to operate as a totally impartial and objective actor. You look at the American occupation in Iraq post 2003, or the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. There is no, the phrase is occupation corrupts, but there is no sort of perfect system in that way. A sense of the Zanzibar crew wants to speak on this.
Yeah, I think one of the points that it just made me, I guess I'll move closer. One of the points that you made me think of, Isaiah and Paula, as you're kind of going back and forth, was sort of that like alternative agenda idea. I think Layla mentioned it a little bit ago, and that can be like a really good thing. I think in international affairs, for example, like we're all here wanting to learn culture and language. Like some of those things are really good exchange. But then I also think about some of those like negative things. Like it's very hard to disconnect like, your own culture, right? And it's not something you should do so when like going into like international development and things. I think sometimes you do risk sort of like a takeover. I know Isaiah was already saying like maybe the proper way of providing that aid, like how can you do that on the right level? And the first thing I thought of was just that there's not like a formula. I think it's like nice to think of it that way, and I've been taught it that way. Like, oh, like put said country in here and then do A, B, and C. But it just doesn't work that way. I think in my experiences, I'm learning more and more. Like it's not just like
an answer that's like mathematical. It's very like individually based. So just sort of thinking about how that's complicated, because on the one hand you have this exchange which can be really positive, and can be dangerous. I mean, you have to be careful about what you're exchanging, but then on the other hand, just this idea that it can be formulaic, and in my experience, like I haven't found that to be true. So just kind of sort of thinking of those two things hand in hand.
Very important point about understanding and respecting local cultures, and how it's not just that we have to adapt to them, but that there's things to learn from them and to celebrate and to emanate outwards rather than just to be pulling other stuff from the outside in. Let's go to the two arguments though and go through some of the key points of them, because I think it's exactly what we're talking about, and I think that it'll be helpful to understanding the pluses and the minuses of the way that you framed it, Isaiah. Let's call them the planners and the searchers. The planners are Sachs and his ilk, and the searchers are Easterly and his ilk. And if we could start off with the planners, can we just recap what are the positive attributes of this argument of the planners?
I didn't read that.
So for planners, I know that a lot of what they did was that they're very good at inspiring people. They're very good at like saying, oh, this is the problem in the world, this is what we need to do to fix it, this is why we should fix it. And so something they're really good at doing is just kind of speaking out to those issues, kind of getting people motivated, and just kind of like getting people like really want to like invest in these issues.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on, I feel like they have more of a general knowledge rather than they don't really know the specifics of the situation. Whereas like the searchers are at the root of the problem and therefore can address the issue directly and know what they can implement to assist those in the community or whatever the issue is.
Good. What else?
Yeah.
What else are the planners up with him?
I think feeding off of that, I think the planners are more oriented around short-term goals and how they can make an instant impact, whereas searchers are maybe looking more at the long-term systemic problems that could be causing a lot of these issues and how we can solve those issues like in a broader sense rather than just solving one little small problem at a time by providing some resource or service that's going to last for a short period and then go away. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no. Another thing that I was just thinking, like, parallels between them, like, planners, I sort of thought of as more like going in with the attitude of being a teacher, like coming in to teach, rather than a searcher might have a little bit more of like a learning attitude, like what can I learn in order to do what I do best, whereas a planner might go in with more of the attitude, like what can I teach in order to come up with that solution.
Carolyn, I think you were trying to say something in Indonesia?
Is he talking?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, I was just saying that I just kind of thinking what the rest of the group is saying with the planners and searchers, that one group is kind of talking about more centralized on certain like solutions, things that they feel like is the most effective, and then the other group is looking at the big picture, what has worked for everyone else and can work the best for just everyone in general that has worked in like different areas and different places that can achieve the most results. Is kind of what I saw.
Yeah. I agree with like Caroline when she talks about like the big picture, or not the big picture, but kind of what works for everyone. That's what a planner is more like. Their ideas can kind of be used in any developing nation, whereas a searcher, it's more specific to the region and than the actual issue that's being discussed.
Yeah, these are all great points. Kate, you brought one up that I hadn't thought of before, and I think we could mull around a little bit in terms of short-term versus long-term, which I think is really easily conflated with works for a lot of people versus works in a very specific case. I think that that's an interesting point. The couple that stood out to me, and I don't want to repeat the good points that you guys made, is just this idea that with the planners, I think that their best attribute is that we just can't let 1 to 3 million African children die of malaria every year. Like, we know how to prevent malaria, and the cure is out there, the prevention is out there, and we don't want to live in a world where that happens. I mean, like, it just, you can't justify that. And to the planners' credit, they're staying awake at night trying to figure out ways to get, Paul, as you framed it, to get these solutions that work for a lot of people to everybody, rather than just having them be restricted to those who have the wealth that can access them. The other thing that I really liked about the planners is the underlying idea of international development, that we're all equal. That even though it's not a literal ladder of development where you start off as a laborer, then a factory worker, and then move on to working in a coal factory, et cetera, but there is this concept of that we are all capable of the same potential, which I like a lot. And then there's the expertise and network piece, that if we have solutions, that we need to share them with others rather than just keeping them to ourselves. What do you guys think is the biggest negative to the planners' approach or their argument?
I don't know if they want to go first.
No, you got it.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
So we just offered up the positive attributes of the planners' argument. There's certainly some negative aspects to the planners' argument. Like, where do they come up short? Like, what's the problem with the planners?
I mean, I think first and foremost, like, lack of implementation. Like, you don't really, they're saying, okay, here's a solution to malaria, but they're not really working with the population on how that funding is going to, how they're going to create a fund to afford netting or whatever medication is necessary. So they kind of have, they have the end goal, but they don't have a way of getting there. I mean, at least to my understanding.
They lack on, they don't see the steps. Or provide the steps or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. I agree with
that. That point is enormous. That is a huge, huge point. It's not just the lack of financial resources, but you have to have a plan to be able to do these things. You don't walk into the classroom and say, I'm going to be a brilliant teacher. You have to actually have the lesson plans, in order to be able to do it, and then you have to be able to adapt the lesson plans to what's actually going on in the classroom. Isaiah, if you didn't know how to edit videos, you wouldn't be of any use to your NGO that's doing the video editing project. Is that you actually have to have the plan to know how to be able to do things. You can't just throw the resources at it and expect that it's going to do it itself. So that's one huge point. What else, guys?
Yeah, I agree. I feel like the big thing with planners is that they're too idealistic. I feel like they really know what to do in theory, but the thing is, they're never the ones who are on the ground. They're never the ones who are actually seeing what needs to be done. They're not the ones seeing the actual solutions and the methods and the mechanisms that are actually beneficial to the people who they are saying that they want to help. So in that sense, they're really just, spewing all this high-minded rhetoric about, oh yes, this is exactly what needs to be done, but they don't know that firsthand.
So there's that element of detachment in terms of them navigating local solutions. I think that's an excellent point as well. So two others that I would mention for you guys in this argument, which you've actually already spoken about in a different form, is this question of why is it that we are responsible? That, yes, you guys are very well-meaning and you've traveled the other side of the world to help other people, but why is it collectively as a society that we are responsible for children dying of malaria in Africa? And I put that out there as a rhetorical question. You have a lot of different answers about that, but in an age where we have all these problems at home, is that the best use of our resources? And then to push back, Isaiah, on your earlier point about why can't we do colonization or development of societies in a really effective way. I can't point to a lot of evidence in the last 15, 20 years or so that major government systems actually work in a radically effective way. That, when you create these gigantic projects, we want for them to have worked, and we aspire for them to work. But look at the response to Hurricane Katrina. Look at the response to rebuilding Iraq. Look at the rollout of healthcare.gov. It's really hard to do these things in an effective way and manage these very big systems. And what Sachs and company and the planners are saying is, let's do international development as a major system, for everybody at once. And I'm a believer, but there's not a lot of recent evidence that that will work without significant buy-in and management, from the local level.
I mean, it kind of saying that everybody the tools to make it as we did. But when I think of like America specifically, I think of like how we came up, and we came up through slavery. We used that to kind of jumpstart the economy and like all that good stuff. So I feel like even that, like looking at America, I mean, it's kind of just like that. I don't know, like now here we are trying to help the rest of the world. It was kind of just like, it was kind of like looking at the end goal, where the planners are, where their head is at and stuff like that, and the searchers as well. So I mean, I don't know, it's like, and I kind of touched upon it in like a heartless kind of way in my paper too, talking about like, like, I don't know, I don't want to get into it actually.
It's a discussion that extends beyond the amount of time that we have, but that's the point of these readings, is to get you thinking about this as a discussion point and this as a topic. So it's okay that you were heartless in your response paper, because I mean the idea is to have a bunch of different viewpoints that we talk about, and I don't have answers that can be encapsulated in the 20 minutes that we have left, but rather that's part of what the questions you guys should be asking on a daily basis, is about your own effectiveness and your impact, and what's making you effective or not. Which takes us to the searchers. And let's start with our Zanzibar group. And Kate, maybe you can roll into whatever comment you were going to make into this question of what are the positive attributes of the searchers' argument? Like, why is it that we want to support the searchers? What do they have right?
Well, one thing I just wanted to comment really quickly on the argument that Isaiah was making about maybe kind of reverting back to the colonization. I think there is an implication there that the developed countries have already done everything possible to try and intervene in the lesser developed countries, and then it's just not working, or that they're not capable themselves of developing. And I think there's really still so many problems with the foreign aid distribution, and I really don't think we have, like Christina was saying, there's no formulaic answer or response that's perfect, and we clearly haven't mastered that in the United States or in other developed countries. So I think first we're going to need to edit our own, look at how we distribute foreign aid and kind of fix some of the problems, because like Ben was saying, I mean, we know how to prevent malaria, but there's still millions of children dying every year from malaria when we have the medical technology to be able to prevent that easily. So why aren't we being able to implement these solutions? So when you're talking about a planner versus a searcher, I think a planner has that idea and is aware that we have the tools to prevent basic fundamental problems like malaria, things that are an international human right that people should never have to worry about. But a searcher is able to like go look at the broader systemic problem and say, okay, how can we implement this into this situation and really fix it, instead of just saying, okay, we have the tools now, then getting all jumbled up in the like how are we going to distribute these funds, and getting tied up in contracts and trade deals and what's going to be most beneficial for them, and looking at your own self-interest. And then the searchers would really get in there and say, okay, like let's find a way to make this work. This is the way to make it work.
So I mean, building off of that, I'd just say like I feel like a solution or like a way to like put that into effect would be to kind of more so than just focus inward and kind of perfect or come closer to like a better, government or whatever within the United States, and then we could just take that abroad and just bless the rest of the world with that. That might sound a little weird, but if the world needs better policies, we should just make them
Well,
domestic, and then just
countries are the people who actually have the most corrupted policies. So these lesser developed countries, I don't think it's that they're incapable of developing. I think that we've actually put a system in place that prevents them from developing. For instance, if you look at almost any African country that is just rich in resources, we don't give them the ability to actually process any resources. And we have pretty crap trade deals in place with most African countries, so we actually are kind of robbing them of their raw resources. And we have really poor trade deals put in place that benefit us to an extreme and really just leave the African country kind of trapped in this cycle where we're just increasing our wealth and they're staying very stagnant. So when you're talking about let's just go in there and put our system because our system works, well, our system is just our system is already here, and I think that's the problem. Maybe we should back out a little bit and let them kind of rise with their trade and pull out of some of our deals that we have that are really binding them in this situation.
I think that we should totally do that. We should definitely back out, and if they could grow, let them grow. If they can't, they can't. But what I said was we should definitely focus inward and just do all that we can do to be the best that we can. If they could catch up, cool. If we find out that they actually don't have what it takes to develop and join this developed world, then they lost. Win or lose game, they lost. They need our help, so we'll intervene and put them on our back.
So there's a couple of things that I want to pull out of there and also jump in on, and one of them is, Paul, this goes back to your earlier point about what would have happened in these places had this not happened, and even in any scenario, you guys take a look at your placements and you take a look at a local leader in your placement who you respect, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a leader of the organization. It's really not possible that someone is going to come in from the outside and do their job better than them, because that's the Easterly argument, is that these local leaders are leading the way in understanding what their community needs and figuring out how to give it to them. Now, the role that this international expertise or assistance can play with these strong local leaders is by sharing best practices, providing other resources, providing additional resources to the direction that they're already headed in. And I mean, that's a very Easterly point in terms of these local leaders know what it is that they're doing, and why should someone in Jeffrey Sachs's office at Harvard or in the UN come in and tell this person how to do their job? They can come in and help them to look at their system and help them to do it better. But it just that's basically a historical lesson, is that local leadership is going to be more efficient than an international implant. One of the other things I really liked about the searcher argument is, and we touched on this in the Sachs piece or the planners, is that implementation really does matter. And that's this piece of, when you talk about how are the classes organized at Mualamat School or at the English-speaking Muslim International School, and the way they've designed those classes and their plan for it, that matters. There's a lot of effort and thought going into that, and you can't just assume that if you were to bombard. I think, Christina, you wrote about this in a way in your response piece with soccer balls, that if you were to bombard rural Morocco with all the soccer balls they could handle, it doesn't mean that you've solved their problem in terms of exercise, fitness, and made them all wonderful soccer players. That you actually need to have a plan for distributing those soccer balls in places where they should go, where there's coaches, where there's pseudo playing fields. That the implementation does indeed matter. And then the other point that is, I think, a really significant attribute of the searcher's argument and why local leadership is so important is there's this element of accountability and feedback that it's very difficult for an international actor to be able to get genuine accountability and feedback for a number of reasons. But when you're supporting local leadership, let's say it's a community-based organization that's providing different kinds of youth programs for at-risk kids in the neighborhood. If they're not providing good programs, if their services are not working, then those people are going to stop coming. They're getting that feedback from their constituency, and there's an accountability to their work. Whereas if we're throwing, $100,000 at that center, they can send us a report and say everything worked out great, and everyone's really happy in the community with the interventions that we're doing. That piece of accountability and feedback is crucial to protecting investments and then to redesigning new initiatives and programs that build off of those investments. On the flip side of this, can we talk for a minute about the negatives of the planner's argument? I certainly think that there are a few. Like I think that Easterly puts forward a lot of attractive ideas, but there's some real negatives in there as well. Does anybody want to take a shot at one or two?
I mean, to be completely honest, I can't answer that question. I really didn't see much that was any attributes that I considered negative. Maybe now thinking about it, instilling their culture and their way of life can, I guess, hinder development in a way if what they're implementing. I mean, we don't want to break tradition, and I think that's a big problem with colonization. And maybe searchers, people who do go to these countries and start working at these NGOs have a negative effect on the community and maybe community building just based off their living standards at home. But I can't imagine that that's the case many times. But yeah. I'm kind of talking because no one else is.
Okay, so in the interest of time, and so I can give you guys a couple last words, let me list off a couple of negatives I see from the Easterly perspective. So a direct quote from Easterly is, "The right plan is no plan." I couldn't disagree with this more. You should never go into a situation where this is your philosophy and you have no plan for what it is that you're going to do, and rely entirely on responding to what is put forward in front of you. That's probably some of the worst professional advice that anyone could ever give you. Is just go to a job interview and say whatever comes to mind, or go and go distribute 1,000 care packages to refugees by just roll the truck up and throw them out the truck and let's see who gets them. You have to have a plan. There's a difference between being flexible and not having a plan. You have to be flexible, but you have to have a plan for how it is that you're going to execute, whether it's a war, whether it's a peace, whether it's a business plan. You have to have a plan. The two other things I have a problem with Easterly are that those kids that don't have the malaria nets that are dying every year, they don't ever get the malaria nets. In Easterly's plan, the pieces never add up to a full solution for everybody. Now, with Sachs's plan, he says the pieces add up, and we have problems with the actual implementation of it, so they don't add up. But at least they're striving to address the entirety of the problem. Whereas Easterly is saying, let's just focus on this one, these very specific pockets. And eventually maybe something will happen, or it's not addressed at all. And being activist by nature, I have a difficult time with that in terms of we don't even have a linkage to something better for everyone. And then there's this other piece where there's a complaint about the foreign aid market or the donor market, and why don't donors support what it is exactly that we're doing. And I think that searchers have to be responsive to donors as well. They have to realize that this is a competitive market, that international aid and assistance is not charity, that these are strategic investments to, let's say, build education systems or political systems or whatever the specific area is, infrastructure. And it's not just for benevolence that we're doing this, but it's so that we can create improve stability, prosperity, whatever the exact case may be. And so I think it's a self-defeating attitude to sit in your NGO or your community-based organization and say, we're doing the most incredible work here, and people should just be lining up to support our work, rather than thinking about how is it that our work can fit into some of these broader opportunities to get funding for what it is that we want to do. And so that's something to be careful of if you ever get into this field professionally, is not getting too high and mighty that everyone should be supporting what you're doing, rather than figuring out how can your piece fit into a picture without compromising what your mission is and what your programs are. So we've got a couple more minutes for comments or questions. What do you guys think? Zanzibar crew.
That means that we're doing.
Oh, did you have something to say in Indonesia? Sorry.
I wanted to know if you had any response.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I'll go. I just thought they started talking. I didn't want to cut you off. I appreciate the last point that you made, Ben, with sort of like how, rather than saying like, oh, look at what we're doing, like this is so great, versus like how can you put your mission, like how can it fit into the greater picture. I just wanted to, this is sort of anecdotal, it's not some like grand statement to make. It happened in my school where I was in a meeting with the head teacher in my school, and he went over what the Ministry of Education had just told them, sort of about like what the schools can be doing to improve things. And I looked at him, he was explaining to me in English, and I just said, how can I help like with that? And he sort of was so surprised. He was just like, and sort of like didn't have an answer. And I was like, well, just let me know. Like, if you think of something, like I'll keep teaching, and like, if you ever want to just give me an idea, and I'll try and think of things on my end too. So I just appreciated what you said. Like, it just happened in a very like personal way, and it struck me as something that's so important. That I definitely have a mission in the school, and for being a part of the AUA, but it's nice to see it happen like on a one-on-one basis, with one of my higher ups, to have someone say like, for me to ask like, how can I fit into this mission with my own goals too. So I don't know, I just I was struck by that. So that's all.
That's a nice anecdote, and it's a great attitude to have. And he's probably surprised by it, because unfortunately not enough people have that attitude of, okay, well how can I help fit into your plan and help create a success? So when we pick partners for this program or other programs, there's a checklist that I go through that ideally your partners are heading to some level of proficiency, or your hosts are heading to some level of proficiency, and it answers the question of, is this good / effective international development? And so the things that I look for after having working in this field for a number of years, different contexts, a couple of different countries, and also from the government perspective, is number one, is this locally led? Is this leadership of the community, working for the community, or is this an international donor, just flushing a lot of money onto a problem without necessarily a lot of traction? Number two, does this address a big picture problem, like education, human rights, women's empowerment, protection of the environment? Are these partners or potential partners are working on something that we have shared values on, and that rather than projecting our ideas onto them, we already share common ideas on this topic, and so we have that common ground. Number three is the implementation question. So assuming that we have a good local leader, we have a relevant mission that the organization or school is working on, do they actually have a plan to implement their mission? And is their plan being implemented designed and implemented with equal care. A lot of people have good ideas, but then it's a totally different skill set to be able to implement good ideas. And so, it's like sort of the difference between a visionary and a manager. Visionaries might not be able to, manage to get from A to B, and managers might not have the ideas about how to cure malaria, but they're in the field of international development. There's a marriage between the two of needing both. The fourth thing is are there elements of accountability here to the beneficiary demographic, so that if you're trying to distribute malaria nets, are you measuring in some sort of way that the nets are being distributed? Like with the autism NGO we work with in Tajikistan, are families coming back to participate in the programming that are being offered by the organization? Number 5 and number 6 are both a little bit more lofty in terms of, can this be brought to scale? Is there something that's being done here that can be replicated in other places? And then number 6 is this sustainable? We want for the efforts that you guys are putting in and that other volunteers are putting in to add up to something and not for it to be a flash in the pan. And so, are they solicited, if they're an NGO, are they looking for donor funding for different things, or do they have a small agro-business that supports their operations? What's their pipeline for being, at work and in business a year from now? So I've offered those out for you guys, for those to be things that you look at as well in terms of evaluating organizations. One of the potential final projects for this course is to write a professional memo about the organization, and those are tools for analyzing, how effective is this organization from my perspective, not my perspective, your perspective, in these different areas. And then I guess as a closing comment on this topic is that I would work very hard as a practitioner in this field for the summer to make something work, to make anything work, no matter how small it is, whether it's a debate club, whether it's a series of videos that are going to be shown on International Youth Day, but make that very local task, make that work in that very localized setting, but don't lose track of that big picture of why you're doing this and why this is important and whether there's something here that can be replicated in other places. Because that's the bringing together of the Easterly argument and the Sachs argument, is that you're getting that very, very local level impact. But for you guys as international practitioners, if that very, very local impact only stops in that community and is not spread to other communities or connected to something larger, then we lose out on an opportunity. Great that those other people's lives are better. There was a chance to do more with that. The end. So, I have blog posts from the Indonesia group, and I understand I'm getting blog posts from the Zanzibar guys pretty soon. Oh, they took the end literally.
I was wondering, what's that